In this video, I'm going to go over how you can use SceneForge Studio's timeline animation system to add motion and animatics to your scene. To get started, you're going to want to open up the timeline panel, available in stage mode and shoot mode, by clicking the little icon in the bottom left corner. That expands it on the screen. Now, if you're familiar with any other type of non-linear editing software, this uses keyframes much like those, so I'm sure this will be very familiar to you. To add a timeline track for an object, you simply click on the timeline button available within the object's expanded properties. Once you do that, you can see a timeline track for this object. Now, by default, these timeline tracks are transform tracks, meaning that keyframes here represent a position, rotation, and scale, and you can animate those properties to move objects around your scene. So for example, I'm going to move the playhead to the starting position and click the keyframe button. That now represents this position, rotation, and scale as indicated by these values. I can then move it over, change these properties, and click the keyframe button again. And you can see that as I move the playhead, it'll interpolate the motion between those two keyframes. It's worth noting that unlike other softwares, because SceneForge is built for previsualization and basic animatic design, each of these keyframes represent position, rotation, and scale, not only one of those properties. When you're happy with your animation, and of course you can sequence as many other keyframes as you like, you can click the spacebar or play on the timeline, and it'll run through that animation. You can manipulate keyframes by clicking and dragging, or pressing delete, or backspace to remove them. You can also change the easing type by right-clicking and switching between linear, which is the default, ease, which adds a smoothing motion on the in and outbound like that. And you can also do what's called a cut keyframe. And this essentially simulates teleporting the object between positions, like so. So you can see now when I run the timeline, it animates, and then at this point, it immediately jumps to that position. For objects, this is not very useful, but when you're dealing with animated cameras, it is helpful to cut between different camera positions without having to switch between multiple cameras in your scene. Now, this is just the default transform track available in all objects, but some objects, such as lights and cameras, actually have their own parameter tracks to adjust additional values. So I have this light box stand here, and I'm going to go ahead and add another timeline track for this object. And you can see we can manipulate it just as before. To add a basic animation like that. But if we expand the timeline track, you'll see that now we have two additional tracks for intensity and temperature. This allows us to animate the intensity and temperature of the light. So in the same way we can add transform keyframes, I'm going to move the playhead to the beginning, set the intensity and temperature all the way down, create keyframes, and move it over a little bit, adjust these values, and add two more keyframes. So you can see now when I play, the intensity and temperature will change as the animation is playing. Of course, again, you can add as many keyframes as you want. This is just a basic example. It's worth noting that as you scrub through the timeline, the object's motion will change, and you can see these values updating, but the actual parameter track values will not adjust, as you can see here, until you actually press play. That's just to keep you from accidentally overwriting any previous work. Cameras also have an extra couple timeline tracks. If I go into shoot mode, and as I showed in the previous video, I can record the camera's motion, and it'll create a new timeline track with these keyframes being recorded on the transform track every 0.1 seconds. You can see I can play back this motion. If I expand the camera's track, we also have keyframe tracks for focal length, aperture, and focus distance. This allows you to, well, keyframe those different properties of the camera. I can start by keyframing the focal length over here, and just zooming out all the way at the end, and manipulating the aperture and focus distance in the same way. So now when I click play, it'll run all of those things at once for a really coherent, seamless animation. Now you may have noticed that I moved all of these keyframes together. That's very simple. We can just click and drag to highlight multiple keyframes and then drag them as a unit. Additionally, for chunks of keyframes like this, it is helpful to zoom in, which you can do by clicking and dragging the little pink slider at the left. And once you have a timeline sequence you're happy with, you can click Render Camera View to export that to an MP4 or other file types. More information about this system will be done in its own video dedicated to exporting content outside of SceneForge. And so with that, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.